Hello, kids. Today we are going to read My Treasury of Favorite Tales by Enid Blyton. So, we are going to read one story today, and then we can see that we'll read the others later on. So, the first story is The Newspaper Dog. Seems interesting. The Newspaper Dog. So, this is it. Once upon a time, there was a little dog called Tips. He belonged to Mrs. Brown, who lived in Primrose Cottage at the end of Cherry Village. He was a useful little dog. He guarded the house each night for Mrs. Brown. He kept her company when she was alone. He barked at any stranger who came up the front path, and once each week he fetched a newspaper for her from old Mr. Jonathan, who lived all by himself in a little house on the hillside. Mr. Jonathan always bought the newspaper himself and read it. Then he lent it to Mrs. Brown, and after that she passed it on to someone else. She couldn't often find time to go to fetch the paper herself, so Tips fetched it for her. He started off each evening, ran all the way down the village street, went over the ridge that crossed the stream and up the hillside to Mr. Jonathan's cottage. He jumped at the door and pushed it open. Then in he would trot and look for Mr. Jonathan. The old man always had the paper ready for him, neatly folded out with a piece of string round it. He put the packet into Tip's mouth, and off the little dog would go, running all the way home again, not stopping for anything until he reached Primrose Cottage and could drop the paper at Mrs. Brown's feet. One day Mr. Jonathan thought he would do something spring cleaning, so he called on Mrs. Brown and asked her to lend him her ladder. "Dear me, what do you want to go climbing about on ladders for?" Mrs. Brown, in surprise, asked him. "You'll fall off, Mr. Jonathan, and hurt yourself." "Indeed I shan't," said the old man. "I'm going to paint my ceiling white." "Mrs. Brown, it is very dirty, so lend me your step-ladder, there's a good soul." "It's in the shed," said Mrs. Brown. "You can have it for you if you want it, but do pray be careful, Mr. Jonathan, for it's not a very steady pair of steps." Mr. Jonathan found the ladder and took it home. He mixed some paint and started to do his ceiling. It looked lovely. All day he worked at it and then went to bed. He began again next day, whistling to himself, sloshing about the ceiling with the paint, quite enjoying himself. And then a dreadful thing happened. The postman dropped some letters in the letterbox, gave such a loud rat-a-tat-tat that the shock made old Mr. Jonathan fall off his ladder. Down he went, and when he tried to get up, he found that he couldn't. Oh dear, I must have sprained my ankle, or broken my leg, or something. The old man groaned. "Whatever shall I do? Nobody else will come today, and I can't phone for the doctor. I have no neighbors to call to. I'm all alone." Mr. Jonathan lay there on the floor groaning. He really didn't know what he was going to do. Perhaps he would have to stay there all night long, if only somebody would come. But there was nobody to come to at all. And just as he was thinking that, Mr. Jonathan heard the sound of pitter-pattering feet, and someone came running up the front path. Then a little body hurled itself against the door, which opened at once. It was Tips, the little newspaper dog, coming to get the evening newspaper. He saw Mr. Jonathan lying on the floor, and he was puzzled. He ran up to him and licked his hand. Then he sat down with his head on one side and said, "Woof." That was his way of saying, "What's the matter? Can I help you?" "I wish you could, Tips," said Mr. Jonathan, and then he suddenly looked more cheerful. Perhaps Tips could help him. He looked around. The newspaper was on a chair, already tied up with a string for Mrs. Jones. "There's the paper, Tips," said Mr. Jonathan, pointing. "Fetch it here." Tips saw the paper and took it into his mouth. He was just going to run off with it when Mr. Jonathan called him back. Don't go yet, Tips, he said. Bring the paper here. The clever little dog understood. He ran over to Mr. Jonathan with the paper in his mouth. Mr. Jonathan took a pencil from his pocket and wrote in large letters across the top of the paper, Mrs. Brown, I've fallen off the ladder. Please fetch the doctor, Mr. Jonathan. Then he pushed the paper once more into Tip's mouth and patted. The waiting dog, go home now, he said. Tips ran off, puzzling his little head to know why Mr. Jonathan was on the floor. He ran to Mrs. Brown as soon as he reached Primrose Cottage and dropped the paper at her feet. She picked it up and caught sight of the message scribbled on top. Good gracious me, she cried. Poor old Mr. Jonathan. He's tumbled off the ladder. She went for the doctor at once, and he took her along to Mr. Jonathan in his car. It wasn't long before they had him safely in bed, his leg bandaged up, and a nice hot drink beside him. It was my clever little dog Tips who found Mr. Jonathan when he came for my paper this evening, said Mrs. Brown proudly to the doctor. Mr. Jonathan wrote a message on the paper, and of course I saw it when Tips dropped the paper at my feet. Mr. Jonathan soon got well, and one morning Mrs. Brown and Tips met him going shopping for the first time, leaning on a stick. Now, wherever are you going? Cried Mrs. Brown. I'm sure there's no shopping so important that I can't do it for you. Whatever it is, you must buy, Mr. Jonathan. It's something very special, said Mr. Jonathan with a smile, and he went into a little shop nearby, beckoning Tips and Mrs. Brown in. 2. And what do you suppose the special bit of shopping was? Why, a fine red collar for Tips. That's to show everyone what a clever, helpful little chap he is, said Mr. Jonathan, putting it round the little dog's neck. He really does deserve it. I think so too. Don't you? So we're done with the story of the little newspaper dog, and we'll come back with a new story. Goodbye, kids.